Hi everyone, I am Dr.V.VIJI, Associate Professor of Economics, A.D.M.COLLEGE for Women, NAGAPATTINAM. Today we are going to see new classical theory in macroeconomics. The new classical macroeconomics is an attempt to repudiate and modify Keynesian and monetarist about the role of macroeconomic stabilization policy in the light of the classical school of thought. Keynesians advocate demand management policies, both fiscal and monetary, to stabilize the economy, favor active interventions, fiscal and monetary policies. They do not regard the two policies as active but complementary to each other, but they depend more on explanatory fiscal policy to all recessions which threatening rising unemployment with little or no growth in the economy. However, combined deflationary fiscal policy with monetary policy to control boom and inflation. The new classical macroeconomics during the late 1970s, when the debate between Keynesian and monetarists statemented, the new classical macroeconomics emerged based on classical microeconomics. It was developed by Robert Lucas, Thomas Signet, Robert Barrow and Neil Walsh in America and Patrick Minford in England. The new classical economists is based on the following principles or hypotheses. First one is market continuously clear. Second one is rational expectations. The third thing is aggregate supply hypothesis. The hypotheses 1 and 3 are classical, but their analysis is new. The second hypothesis on national expectations is totally new. Therefore, these principles constitute the new classical macroeconomics which are discussed below. Markets continuously clear. The new classical economist assumes that all markets continuously clear in the economy. Prices and adjust continuously clear markets. The economy is in state of continuous equilibrium both in the short run and long run, where all markets clears. The new aspects from Keynesians and monetarists over market clearing. According to Keynesians, markets may clear due to slow price adjustments. So the economy may remain in a state of disequilibrium. Monetarists assumes that markets have a tendency to clear. Prices and wages are fairly flexible. Therefore, the economy may be in disequilibrium temporarily in the short run and attain equilibrium in the long run. The new classical assumes that markets clears intensively and there is no disequilibrium even in the short run. Since price and wage adjustments are almost instinctively all unemployment in equilibrium, unemployment, whatever level of unemployment is found in the economy. It is the natural rate of unemployment or voluntary unemployment. An increase in the natural level of unemployment over time is the result of reluctance of people to take jobs due to lack of incentives. Now we have to see the diagrammatical explanation. The new classical labor market equilibrium, where SSL is the labor supply curve, which is vertical. ONT labor force when wage rates are above the competitive level. DDL is the labor demand curve. ONT is the total labor force in the economy. The two curves intersected at E which is the market clearing equilibrium. This point where ON workers are willing to work at the market wage rate OW. This is the full employment equilibrium. But NNT is equal to EV. Workers out of the total labor force ONT are not prepared to work at the market wage rate OW. They are voluntarily unemployed. They may prefer a higher wage than the equilibrium rate, leisure or other activities, etc. Second one is rational expectation. One of the most important principles of the new classical macroeconomics is the national expectation hypothesis. The Ratak's hypothesis, as it is called, hawks that economic agents, individuals, firms, etc. form expectations of the future value of economic variables like prices, incomes, etc. by using all the economic information available to them. The new classical economists use Ratak's to explain the Phillips curve in the inflation theory. According to them, rational expectations are not based on past rates of inflation, but on the current state of the economy and policies being followed by the government. Workers and firms base their information on various forecasts made by specialists and agencies and government announcements and reports. On the basis of such current information, they predict the rate of information. The new classical short-run vertical Phillips curves is shown in the figure as PC at the natural unemployment rate UN. If people underpredict the rate of inflation, expected inflation rate is less than the actual rate. They will believe that aggregate demand has increased. As a result, output and employment rise. This shifts the short-run Phillips curves PC to the left as PCL because unemployment temporarily falls to U1 below the natural rate UN. If on the other hand, people overpredict the rate of inflation, that is expected inflation rate is more than the actual rate, they will believe that aggregate demand has fallen and the output and employment fall. This shifts the short-run Phillips curve PC to the right as PC1 because unemployment temporarily rise to UP1 above the natural rate UN, but the actual position of the short-run Phillips curve on the average will be PC at the natural unemployment rate UN. In such situation, workers overpredict the 4% rate of inflation, employment will fall as workers believe that their real wage are lower than they actually are get. So they work less, output falls as firms believe that the relative prices of their products have fallen. With the fall in employment and output, the economy moves from point A to C due to an unanticipated fall in wages and prices. Thus, points B, A, C trace out a downward sloping apparent short-run Phillips curve PC. Of the new classical macroeconomics, when people unpredict real wage and relative prices, but the true short-run Phillips curves of the new classicals is always vertical like the PC curves. Aggregate supply hypothesis. The new classical macroeconomics incorporates the low-cost aggregate supply hypothesis based on two assumptions. The first one is rational decision taken by workers and firms reflect their optimized behavior, and the second one is the supply of labor by workers and output by firm depend upon relative prices. Thus, the aggregate supply hypothesis is derived from optimized behavior of workers and firms about supply of labor, and goods which depends on relative prices only. We first study the labor market and then the goods market to explain the aggregate supply hypothesis. The labor market, workers make decisions about work and leisure in the present with the future in mind. They also have some idea about the normal expected real wage. If the current real wage is above the normal real wage, workers will have an incentive to work more in the present in order to have more leisure in the future. When the real wage is expected to be lower, on the other hand, if the current real wage is less than the normal real wage, workers will have an incentive to take more leisure in the present in the anticipation of working more in the future when the real wage is expected to be higher. This behavior of workers to substitute current leisure for future leisure and vice versa is known as intertemporal substitution. From this, the new classical economists infer that the short-run supply curve of labor is relatively elastic because expected change in the real wage are temporary. If the shift in aggregate demand due to increase in the money supply is anticipated, firms will irrespective the increase in general and relative prices. They will want to produce more and increase the demand for workers, which will rise the real wage rate. In the figure, the AD curve will shift upward to AD1 and intersect the SRAS curve at point B. The number of employed workers will increase from OL to OL1, along with the rise in real wage to WIP1. This increase in employment in the short run is only temporary. But when firms fully adjusted their price expectations in the long run, the SRAS curve will shift to SRAS1 to intersect the AD1 curve at C, with no change in the level of OL workers employed through at a higher real wage W1P2. Now we pass on to the goods market. Consider the goods market in this figure where the economy is initially in equilibrium at point A, where the curves LRAS, AD and SRAS intersect. Here the price level OP is fully anticipated and OY is the long run equilibrium level of output. Suppose there is increase in aggregate demand due to anticipated increase in the money supply. This will shift the AD curve upward to the right to AD1. As a result, there is an immediate upward revision of price expectation to OP2. Firms increase the supplies of goods and SRAS curve shifts upward to the left to SRAS. There is now a new equilibrium at point C, where the curves AD, SRAS1 and LRAS intersect. The price level moves straight from OP to OP2 and the economy moves from A to C with no increase in the output level OY. However, if the increase in aggregate demand is anticipated due to increase in the money supply, the economy moves from the initial equilibrium point A to B at the intersection of AD and SRAS, curve rising from OP to OP1 and output increased from OY to OY1 level. But this will be only in the economy goes through an adjustment process, it will return to its long run equilibrium output at OP2 price level. Policy implications of new classical macroeconomics. The new classical macroeconomics has a number of policy implications which are explained as under. First one is policy ineffectiveness proposition. The new classical macroeconomic analysis hold that with the rational expectations and flexible prices and wages in monetary policy, if anticipated in advance, will have no effect on output and employment in the short run. This is the policy ineffectiveness proposition, unanticipated increase in the money supply that will affect output and employment. Second implications, importance of systematic monetary policy. According to the new classical analysis, anticipated changes in aggregate demand will have no effect on output and employment. Even in the short run, pursuing a systematic monetary policy is one which takes into account any known rule, such as policy can be fully predicted by the private sector before the monetary authority actually acts upon it. So, private buyers and sellers who anticipated increase in the money supply adjust their purchase and sales through flexible wages and prices. Third implication is policy predictability. The new classical approach is based on the presumption that national economic agents have expectations about what the monetary authority is going to announce, and this influences their behavior. But it is the predictability of policy announcements of monetary authority that agents from expectations. Thus, the new classical policy implies that announced changes in monetary policy will have no effect on output and employment. Even in the short run, provided the policy is predictable, suppose there is an announced and predictable reduction in the money supply. Fourth implication is the Lucas critics. Robert Lucas criticized the building of econometric macroeconomic models of the economy for policy evaluation. According to Lucas, such models were based on parameters derived from past data collected under particular policies. Any attempts to use such macroeconomic models to predict the consequences of alternative policies may be wrong. This is because the parameters of such models may change as economic agents adjust their expectations and behavior to the new policy. Fifth implication is policies to increase aggregate supply. One of the important policy implications of new classic macroeconomic relates to the nature of policies to be followed by the authorities to increase output, reduce unemployment. In the new classical analysis, changes in output and employment are based on the equilibrium supply decisions of firms and workers given their perceptions of relative prices. It follows that the appropriate policy measure to increase output and reduce unemployment are directed towards increasing aggregate supply of output and labor. New classical macroeconomists recommended a variety of measures to increase output and reduce unemployment that indirectly increase aggregate supply of output and labor. They relate to reduction in the power of trade unions, reduction in unemployment benefits, tax reforms to remove poverty and raise incomes of the unprivileged, measures to increase geographical and occupational mobility of the labor, etc. Now we see the criticism of new classical macroeconomic theory. The new classical macroeconomics has been criticized mainly on the basis of its hypothesis and policy implications. First one is rational expectation hypothesis is unrealistic. The rational expectation hypothesis is the backbone of the new classical approach, has four main objectives. First, it cost much to acquire, process and disseminated publicity available information, so the majority of economic agents cannot act on the basis of rational expectation. Second, the critics point out that information available to government differs from the available to firms and workers. Consequently, expectation of the latter about the expected rate of inflation need not necessarily diverge from the actual rate only by the random error. But the government can accurately forecast about the difference between the expected inflation rate and actual rate on the basis of information available with it. Third, even if both the people and the government have equal access to available information, there is no guarantee that expectation will be rational. Fourth, as the cost of acquiring, processing and disseminating public available information is very high, economic agents may for expectation which are systematically wrong. Thus, the rational expectation hypothesis is unrealistic, and the new classical macroeconomics, which is based on it, stands on weak foundation. Markets do not continuously clear. Critics do not accept the hypothesis that all markets continuously clear. They point out that prices and wages are not flexible. There is collective bargaining in the labor market, which leads to wage contracts leading to sickness of money wages. The rigidity of wage rates implies that they adjust to market forces relatively slowly because wage contracts are binding for 2 or 3 years at a time. Similarly, the expected price level at the beginning of the period is expected to hold till the end of the period. As a result, labor market and goods market are unable to clear continuously. As pointed out by Dobbin, the market clearing assumption is just an assumption and nothing more than that. Aggregate supply hypothesis unacceptable. Economists do not accept the aggregate supply hypothesis that changes in output and employment reflect voluntarily response of workers and firms to perceived changes in relative prices according to them. It is changes in aggregate demand announced by the monetary authority that influence output and employment both in the short run and long run. Thank you.